Hi, Abeera. Welcome to Better Tech. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. So, why don't we start off with your introduction first so that our audience is acquainted?
Yeah, Anna, thank you for having me. So my name is Abeera Akhtar. I'm originally from Pakistan, but currently based in the US. My background is more in kind of like tech for international development, social entrepreneurship, and like with a focus on women empowerment. And I currently work as the gender-based violence tech product manager at UNICEF.
Great. So, Abeera, the topic that we have for today is responsible innovation for international development. So, first things first, what is responsible innovation? How do you define it? And why does it matter?
I think when you're thinking about responsible innovation, you're building more on the impact that it will have on people. So you're thinking through all of those different aspects and like building with inclusivity and like privacy concerns at the forefront. And like I think like particularly like it matters because I think like especially like right now with like the big platforms we have seen like like when these are certain aspects you don't keep in mind how they can be misused. So I think it's important to like think through all the different impacts that can happen, and like keeping them in mind like throughout your product process.
So, how would you describe the basic terms that constitute responsible innovation from an international development perspective?
I think from an international development perspective, what becomes important is to like realize that um, a lot of the time you're working with like vulnerable populations, right? Like from an international development perspective, you're working either sometimes with like low resource populations, IDPs, refugees. So like especially like when you're reaching out to those, like their security, inclusivity, like everything like matters even more because like let's say like putting their like data at risk puts them like like can literally put their lives at harm. So there's so many other considerations when you're like working with vulnerable populations. And I think the other piece is like understanding that a lot of these are also like low connectivity and like areas where like people have low digital literacy. So there are even more things that like you have to consider when you're building for them, like making sure like such products are like accessible for
Right.
them and actually give them benefits.
So, what would you say are some tangible practices that operationalize responsible innovation while building products in a nonprofit organization?
I think like one thing like there would definitely like understand like first like your audience like in the especially like in the nonprofit world, like who are you building from and like what are certain like challenges they face, and then like also like firstly like what's the value add that your product is providing them, and is there like any way that their security can be like at risk like to using these products, especially like are you collecting any personal like identifiable information and like any of those pieces and like how that can be used against them. I think that is like one piece like you always have to like think through. And
Right.
I think like another piece like once again like I will focus on this is just like accessibility, like making something that like it's like that they can like easily use.
Right. So, how do nonprofit initiatives regulate responsible innovation capabilities and make product development more efficient?
I think like if I have to like speak from like UNICEF's process, like we have like very stringent like procedures. Like even if like you have like the product manager, they're working like with like another like ICTD team. We have very like like very like stringent like data and privacy policies. These are like checked at different levels before anything goes live. You have like compliance aspects that like you have to like take in, and like sometimes it like it can like there are some things like like from like a monitoring and evaluation perspective sometimes that like you would like to measure but you can't, more so just because it can like put your like users at risk. And then another thing is like even like before like a project goes live, like you do like a deep understanding of like what are the risks that come out of it, like how are they being mitigated, and like all of that is like documented because like, especially in a nonprofit like you often have high turnover, so it's important like from one project to the other, like what are like processes like someone followed so that you can like learn from those instead of like like making them yourself, like making like any like mistakes yourself, but like learning from like previous experiences and like building on those.
Right. So, speaking of those, can you please mention some key issues of responsibility in the organization's innovation or production processes? What do you think organizations get wrong about it, or is there something that they lack?
I think one aspect, like I think like sometimes like organizations might not consider is just like how is this affecting like the most marginalized population, and like what are you like building on your end to like make sure like you're protecting like anyone that is like coming on those platforms. And I think this is like definitely like a big piece. I know this has been like raised like especially like for like the larger tech companies, and now they are like highly like revamping their product policy teams. But
Right.
even I think like in the international development space, this is just like so new, so there's just a lot of like learning happening there, and that's kind of just like being like built on as they go.
So, what are some last minute delivery challenges that these nonprofit product building organizations face internationally?
I think a big piece is just like, especially like if you're like reaching out like during a humanitarian crisis, right? Like sometimes you have to respond so quickly, and then it's like there's so much going on like in these spaces. Like let's say like you're responding to like of like a flood in Bangladesh and like developing something like to like help that. I know like a lot of humanitarian organizations right now are trying to get resources together to like respond to the war in Ukraine. So sometimes like you have to like respond extremely quickly to like current geopolitical situations. But then also I think one big aspect is just connectivity, right? Um, Broadband penetration in emerging markets is limited, and like especially like the deeper you go, like even if we take like Pakistan for example, the more like rural you go in, the like the less connectivity you have. So in terms of like providing any like technological products there, those are like some aspects like you have to like sort out, like because if you don't have any like connectivity or like data connection, there are a lot of
Mhm.
these products that cannot be used. And I know there are certain ways, like some of them are like building progressive web apps so that they can be like accessed like offline. So there are ways around it, but they're like definitely like struggles that you face in like last mile delivery.
Right. And what are some technology specific examples of responsible innovation that are regionally and culturally sensitive?
I think like if I'm thinking through certain like products, like I would just say to like look to some investments that like Cello.org is making, or like even like Mercy Core Ventures and a lot of these like other platforms that are like
Mhm.
focusing on like let's say like um products that are like that have like a more like social impact perspective, to give I think like an example of something that like UNICEF has done. Like they have like a peer tracker app called Oki that is like highly contextualized like for like the region that it is for, more like East Asia, and they're very careful about like the information that they're collecting. And it's also like highly like customized, especially for like the perfect users in terms of like how they engage with them, the visuals, and like even like some products like that I'm helping like build at UNICEF. Like that's a main aspect like for us. Like are we contextualizing it for the certain users? What information are we collecting? How are we accounting for the fact that these are like in
Right.
areas where people don't have like like a high level of digital literacy. So like even like any navigation that is built into a platform has to be very intuitive.
Right. So, Abeera, do you think, like, what's your take on this? Did the pandemic affect responsible innovation being rolled out in organizations?
I really think it did because, like, firstly, like if we, especially if you look at international development, it's like largely more old school, right? You've been doing things like in a certain manner, but like especially when and like a lot of for international development work, you go like on ground and like have programs. So obviously, when the pandemic hit, like everything had to be moved, like everything was suddenly like remote. So, so
Mhm.
like you had to be innovative in like how you like provided support, provided solutions, right? Like things like even if we look at just like even not at international development, like everywhere, like you had to provide remote services. So that forced organizations to start thinking more in like from like a technology perspective, like how do you provide services remotely? How do you improve your systems so that we're reaching like those in like low connectivity areas? And I think there are like so many aspects like that weren't a big priority. And I know like funding in this space, like in the tech for international development space, has actually like skyrocketed after the pandemic. So definitely like a lot more movement happening in this space. And I think like it's only going to grow, and which is also just like exciting. Like even if you look at like I think like GitHub social impact team has like also grown, and they're doing like even like within tech companies, this has become like a
Right.
bigger aspect because they've also obviously they've also come under like a lot of scrutiny for like for certain aspects, but the goal is now to kind of like obviously like build responsibly. So even they're like hiring more people who've worked in like, let's say, the tech for international development space, so that they can bring like more of an understanding of like what like the impact tech can have on like your like larger population, and like designing responsibly.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, if you had to put it in like 4 or 5 bullet points, what should the framework or process be to actually implement responsible innovation and products that address social and ethical concerns?
I think like if I had to summarize, like I would definitely like be like first think about like not just like your specific product, but like how it affects like your users in like a larger context. So like think through like a broader picture. The other piece I would be like understand like what is the actual benefit like for your users, like how is like really helping them, and like how are you building effectively like for it, especially when you're like considering people in like let's say like in international development and like in humanitarian settings, right? I think like you have to like specifically like think through like the value add and like how it's actually like making their lives easier. Like for example, if we're talking like about like cryptocurrency, right? Like the fact that you can take like your crypto assets with you to a different country as a refugee, when sometimes your assets are like blocked in your home country, that is like a definite benefit. So like thinking through like those pieces. um the other I think would just be like intuitive design as much as possible, so that it's like something that's like easy to navigate and doesn't overwhelm users. And I guess the other piece would just be like think through very like carefully about the data and privacy concerns, and how like thinking through like what information you're collecting, what security is built in to like make sure that's protected. Yeah, I think that will definitely be like one of the most important things.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So, lastly, Abeera, what are some expected benefits of responsible innovation strategically, and how can these gains be extended for the future?
I mean, I think like there's so many benefits, but I think like essentially like one big aspect is just like you'll be like design like when you're designing like responsibly, you're putting the people, their privacy, their needs at the forefront, and like you're thinking not just how it affects like a user, but like impacts their context broadly. So I think like when you're like thinking like all of for like all of those aspects, you're just like obviously like it's like more hard work, and like there are other things like have you think of, but I think like in the long run it leaves you like better positioned from like a reputation standpoint for for like a company as well, but just like from like a user safety perspective, and like
Yeah.
the impact that it can have, right? Like the more misinformation you give to people, the less you take away from them like being able to make like correct decisions, and like pushes them in a certain manner. So like all of these things, like if you think through it, and I know like a lot of these times these aren't like easy questions to answer, but like they have to be, otherwise like we'll come into like a lot of the situations that we've already have. And I think like when we're talking about extending them for the future, like I said, I think tech for international development is like relatively new as a space, but it's also like growing. So the fact like if a lot of the learnings from these are documented and like shared across different organizations and individuals, which I think is happening. You have a lot of like learning, like communities of learning in this space. You could
Right.
just like, like learn from each other, not make the same mistakes, and just like have more like effective frameworks moving forward. Like I think one example of this is the principles of digital development that currently exist. And like even if like those 10 principles, like for example, one is like, like be data driven, or like use and improve, and like all of these, even if like you like think through those, you can definitely like have a product, let's say, that is like more geared towards like responsible innovation per se.
Right, absolutely. So that wraps up our episode for today. Thanks so much for joining us on Better Tech.